There's a reason simplicity doesn't feel safe. Not because it lacks power, but because it dissolves the illusion that power must be earned. For most people, quantum manifestation feels confusing not because it's complex, but because it's not. It operates through frequency alignment, not effort, through coherence, not repetition. And yet we overcomplicate. We add layers, loops, pressure, not because the universe needs them, but because our nervous system does. Somewhere along the way, we learned that peace is suspicious, that stillness means something is wrong, that if it's too easy, it's probably not real. This conditioning isn't just mental, it's vibrational. The nervous system wires itself around what it knows, and for many, what it knows is stress. The inner child equated effort with survival. The body learned to brace, even enjoy. And so, when manifestation begins to flow without resistance, the ego doesn't celebrate, it flinches. Simplicity threatens the identity that was built on complexity. It strips away the tasks, the effort, the proving, and that can feel like loss, like emptiness, like danger. Because if you didn't work for it, how can you trust it? But the quantum field doesn't care how hard you try. It doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to signal. And when your signal is clear, not because of effort, but because of emotional alignment, the shift happens faster than the mind can process. It happens not through doing, but through being. There's a filter in the brain called the reticular activating system. Its job is to decide what's important. And unless you've retrained it, it often equates importance with stress, which means simplicity gets filtered out, dismissed, rejected before it has a chance to integrate. Not because it doesn't work, but because the body doesn't yet feel safe inside it. So we'll begin here with this paradox, that what you've been seeking may already be available, but so quiet that your system can't receive it. In the next few minutes, we'll explore why simplicity collapses timelines more powerfully than force ever could, and why, until now, part of you has unconsciously pushed it away. Because when you stop chasing complexity, you begin to feel the field. And when the field is felt, it begins to move. There's a hidden tension many don't notice. When manifestation begins to feel effortless, a part of you quietly resists. Not the conscious part, the one that says it's ready to receive, but the part beneath that. The part trained by experience to believe that ease is suspicious. That if it's not hard, it's not real. That if it doesn't hurt a little, it won't last. This is the body's oldest code. It doesn't trust simplicity because simplicity never felt safe. It learned early on, sometimes in childhood, sometimes in trauma, that reward only comes after tension. That nothing is worth receiving unless it's earned through stress. And even now, with all your tools, all your awareness, the nervous system still scans for effort as proof of legitimacy. This is not a character flaw. It's a survival imprint. Over time, the brain and body become conditioned to chase outcomes through strain. Dopamine, the reward chemical, becomes entangled with delay. Cortisol, the stress hormone, becomes the marker of doing something important. If there's no pressure, the system dismisses the experience as meaningless. This is why peace often feels empty, why stillness triggers urgency, and why instant alignment feels like a trick. But manifestation doesn't follow this equation. The quantum field doesn't reward effort. It responds to frequency, to coherence. And coherence cannot be forced. It only emerges when the mind stops chasing and the body stops bracing. Imagine trying to sculpt the wind, precise, committed, determined, but using a material that only responds to softness. That's what happens when you over-effort in a vibrational reality. The more you push, the less you align. The more you strategize, the more noise you introduce to your field. The field isn't ignoring you, it's simply reflecting the static. Your nervous system doesn't sabotage your manifestation out of fear of change. It interrupts it because change without stress doesn't match the past. And if it doesn't match the past, the body assumes it's unsafe. This is how identity blocks alignment, not because it doesn't want more, but because it doesn't yet trust the way more arrives. That's why stillness isn't just rest, it's reprogramming. A 90-second pause after setting an intention can begin to rewire the body's pattern, teaching it that calm can coexist with power, that relaxation can carry weight, that presence is not emptiness, it's precision. Polyvagal theory explains this with clarity. Until the body associates safety with stillness, simplicity will continue to feel like risk. But once that association shifts, once ease becomes familiar, the field responds faster. Not because you're doing more, but because you finally stopped proving. And in that quiet, the signal becomes clear.
Sometimes, the more closely you stare at a desire, the further away it feels. Not because you're misaligned, but because your focus is saturated with tension. What seems like clarity may actually be surveillance. And in the quantum field, surveillance doesn't magnetize, it destabilizes. The observer effect in quantum physics shows that the act of observing a particle can collapse it into a defined state. But it doesn't explain what kind of observation creates coherence or chaos. Because it's not just the act of watching that shapes the field, it's the vibration behind the watcher. The emotional signature of the observer determines the outcome. And when that observer is vibrating scarcity, doubt, or obsession, the wave collapses, but not where you intended. The desire becomes hyper-watched, monitored, measured. You check the field as if it owes you feedback. You look for signs not with faith, but with urgency. And beneath that urgency is the frequency of not enough, the signal of distrust, the nervous system interpreting silence as failure, when it might actually be alignment. Overfocus isn't presence, it's pressure disguised as precision. It says, if I don't track this moment by moment, it won't manifest. But that vigilance comes from fear, not resonance, from insecurity, not embodiment. And the field reads that signal more clearly than your vision board ever could. Every time you check if it's working, you signal that you believe it isn't. And that signal, repeated, becomes the instruction the field responds to, not your intention, your transmission. Because the quantum self doesn't obsess, it aligns and releases. It knows that neutrality is not indifference, it's power without contraction. This is the distortion behind what many call visualization. Not the act of seeing the desired outcome, but the emotional demand that it show up on your schedule. The quantum field doesn't follow deadlines, it follows vibration. And vibration isn't tracked by time, it's tracked by coherence. The brain's prefrontal cortex, when overactivated by worry or obsessive tracking, creates rigidity. In that rigidity, coherence breaks. And when coherence breaks, the timeline cannot stabilize. You've collapsed the wave, just not into the timeline you meant to call in. That's why learning to hold your intention without gripping it becomes a sacred skill. To become the blind observer, to set the signal and then release the need to watch it every second. Not because you're giving up, but because your trust has become more powerful than your need to control. This is not spiritual passivity, it's vibrational precision. And precision doesn't beg, it doesn't monitor, it radiates, quietly, consistently, without urgency. Because once your signal is stable, the field can finally respond.
The field doesn't respond to what you want. It responds to what you are emotionally rehearsing. And sometimes, without realizing it, you are rehearsing the very version of you that cannot hold what you're asking for. You may visualize the new reality. You may script the version of life you long to live. But if your emotional body is still looping the patterns of guilt, doubt, or shame, then those are the frequencies the field is instructed to stabilize. Not consciously, not maliciously, but vibrationally. Identity is not just who you think you are. It's the emotional tone your nervous system wakes up in each day. The way you move, the micro decisions you make, the posture of your field. You cannot manifest freedom while maintaining the frequency of self-punishment. You cannot manifest expansion while still breathing in a rhythm that says it's not safe to grow. Wanting something new while embodying the emotional habits of the old timeline is like singing one song while trying to play another melody. The dissonance creates friction. The signal gets confused, and the field reflects that confusion. A man once practiced visualization daily. He was clear, consistent, but nothing changed, until one day, through somatic inquiry, he realized his field was still vibrating guilt. Not guilt from his current choices, but inherited emotional debt from childhood. The feeling that joy must be earned, that receiving too easily meant something would be taken away. He didn't change his technique, he changed the signal, and within weeks his reality shifted. This is not a story of mindset, it's a story of embodiment. The version of you that receives with ease has a different frequency, a different emotional rhythm. And until that rhythm becomes familiar, the old signal will keep anchoring the timeline you're trying to leave. This is why vibrational micro-tracking becomes a powerful tool, not to control the field, but to reveal the subtle habits of your old identity. The phrases you repeat, the tension in your breath, the reactions you normalize. If 5 actions or emotional tones each day reflect your old self, begin by choosing 2 to invert, not performatively, but symbolically, not to prove anything, but to shift the tone. Your field is constantly being reinforced by repetition. This is how emotional entrainment works. Neurochemical loops seek the path of least resistance, and the body chooses what it knows. But when you introduce coherence, even through one new behavior, the loop begins to weaken. The emotional blueprint starts to dissolve. You don't have to rewrite your identity overnight. You only have to become aware of what your field is rehearsing. Because what it rehearses, it remembers. And what it remembers, it manifests.
There is a doorway most people overlook, not because it's hidden, but because it's too quiet. It doesn't arrive with signs or certainty. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like nothing, like silence, like the absence of everything you thought was necessary. But this is the portal, not the absence of power, the absence of noise. The nervous system has been trained to equate stimulation with meaning. If it's loud, it must be real. If it's dramatic, it must be transformation. But the field doesn't shift through drama. It shifts through stillness. When the external input stops flooding your awareness, the inner frequency becomes audible again. And that's the signal the field responds to. Simplicity is not emptiness. It's structure without distortion, resonance without interruption. Like a tuning fork humming in a quiet room, it doesn't force anything. It attracts coherence through presence alone. But to reach that frequency, you have to stop adding layers. Not because the layers are wrong, but because they crowd the signal. The field bends when the inner environment quiets enough to hold a steady tone. This is why people often experience powerful shifts in meditation or after extended silence. The absence of stimulation allows coherence to rise. The intention stops being diluted by effort. The signal becomes pure. There is a woman who spent 3 months in constant spiritual practice, visualizing, journaling, scripting. She followed every instruction, but her body stayed tense. Her mind stayed restless. Then she dropped it all, not out of defeat, but fatigue. For 10 days, she stopped trying. No methods, no goals, just stillness. And in that pause, her field reset. The reality she had been chasing began to move toward her, without force, without ritual, without struggle. This is the energetic paradox. When you stop filling the space, the field fills in. When the signal is stable, the shift occurs. Not through performance, but through surrender. Not through repetition, but through resonance. Field coherence increases in low-noise states. This is not theory, it's measurable. The heart and brain find natural rhythm when input decreases. Focused breath, silent presence, and intention without attachment create the environment for field absorption. The moment the nervous system no longer needs stimulation to feel safe, the simplicity becomes magnetic. That's why a daily zero-input window becomes more than rest. It becomes ritual. A space without scrolling, without noise, without goals. Not as avoidance, but as alignment. 20 minutes where the only thing being broadcast is your cleanest signal. The field doesn't need more effort. It needs less interruption. And when your signal stabilizes in silence, reality finally has room to respond. Doing nothing is rarely praised, yet in the quantum field, it is often the most aligned response. Not because you've given up, but because the frequency is already aligned, and anything more would interfere. The moment your vibration matches what you're calling in, any extra movement becomes static. But this goes against how most people were trained. We've been conditioned to measure our value through effort, to interpret silence as failure, and to respond to inner peace with suspicion. So when stillness becomes available, not as avoidance, but as coherence, the nervous system often doesn't know how to receive it. Stillness in this context isn't the absence of power. It's the presence of undisturbed signal. When your intention has been broadcast with clarity, and your emotional field no longer carries contradiction, you reach a kind of vibrational saturation. The work is already done. And in that moment, less isn't lack, it's completion. Neuroscience supports this. In theta states, the brainwave patterns linked to deep relaxation and integration, your system becomes more impressionable, more receptive. These are not states of passivity, they are states of imprinting. During this window, coherence is absorbed more deeply, the field responds more precisely, and the body, instead of doing, begins to embody. But most people miss this window, not because they don't want to align, but because the simplicity feels too unfamiliar. The moment things begin to flow, the impulse to act resurfaces, often out of habit. Something says, I should be doing more, even though the alignment is already complete, even though the field is already shifting. The result is interruption, like touching a still pool to check for ripples and creating new ones. Not because anything was wrong, but because the silence felt too vulnerable, too quiet to be trusted. Doing nothing at the right vibrational moment isn't about inaction, it's about entrainment. In quantum feedback and coherence-based therapies, it's observed that when a system is exposed to a steady, clear signal, it begins to synchronize. The field aligns, not through pressure, but through resonance. That's why timing matters, not in terms of deadlines, but in terms of readiness. When your body feels aligned, when your mind softens without collapse, and when your desire is no longer tinged with urgency, that's when less becomes the instruction. That's when stillness becomes the delivery mechanism. This is not about waiting endlessly. It's about recognizing when the work is complete and giving the field the space to respond. The aligned moment doesn't need reinforcement. It needs presence. Because when your field is stable, the shift happens on its own.
Simplicity is not the absence of power. It's its purest form. Not diluted by effort, not disguised by performance, but present, steady, and clear. In a world that taught you to earn everything through struggle, ease feels like a risk. But in the quantum field, ease is precision. The nervous system doesn't resist change because it's hard. It resists change that doesn't follow the old rules. And one of the oldest rules says, if it doesn't hurt, it won't last. But manifestation doesn't care about that rule. It responds to coherence, not exhaustion. So the shift is not about doing less out of avoidance. It's about doing less because the signal is already aligned. When the emotional body stops trying to prove worth, when the breath softens and presence deepens, what you're seeking becomes able to find you. Not because you forced it,
but because you finally matched it. Still, the body needs a new association. That's where ritual becomes anchor. One small act per day, not to manifest faster, but to remind your field, this is who I already am. A scent, a sound, a still moment, not to reach for the timeline, but to stabilize it. Because that's the key. Stabilization, not seeking. Coherence, not control. The more your body learns that safety exists in stillness, the more reality responds with clarity. Not through force, through frequency. You don't lose power when you let it be easy. You reclaim the kind of power that doesn't need to shout to be felt. A tuning fork doesn't scream. It resonates. And that's what makes everything move.